can describe yourself as you like to. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our International Book Club. And we have an amazing treat in store on my virtual sofa here. I have the amazing Meriel Schindler. And today we're going to be reviewing her book, The Lost Cafe Schindler. We've had lots of great questions. And so I'll be taking Meriel through those. But firstly, I think the best person to introduce and talk about Meriel is Meriel herself. So Meriel, welcome, and tell us a little bit about you.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much to my good friend Harriet for inviting me to her virtual sofa, as I called it this morning. So Harriet and I have known each other for a long time, and I am... What am I? I'm a writer, but I'm also a lawyer. I'm a solicitor in London. I'm head of an employment team at the city firm of Withers Worldwide. And I have had that role for well over 30 years. I've been doing it a long time. And what I enjoy about that role is often dealing with high-profile, interesting clients who get themselves into a mess, or who need their contract reviewing, etc. So that's what I do. And I sort of liken my role a little bit to a hostage negotiator, because sometimes, my clients need rescuing. And I have these, fast, intense engagements with people, and I love it. I really love what I do. On a personal note, I'm married. I have three pretty much grown-up children, and they have been an enormous support and inspiration to the book. And the book was born out of, in a sense, what I can only describe as a very difficult and very fractious relationship with my father. And when he died in 2017, it allowed me the time and the space to go back and think about that relationship and the way in which the Second World War had cast an enormous shadow over his life, but also over my life. I was born in 1964, so well after the war, but it still managed to cast a shadow. And the result of those ponderings was The Lost Cafe Schindler. And it's a book. I've tried to develop an elevator pitch, and I think Harriet would be much better at this than I would be. But actually, it's quite difficult to describe it, because it's about, the strapline is one family, two world wars, and a quest for truth. Now, the original strapline, which I'll share with you, provided you don't tell anyone, was one family, two world wars, and many cakes. That strapline bit the dust because the marketing team at Hodder didn't like it. But it was about the main character in the book is, in fact, the cafe, this wonderful place founded in 1922 by my grandfather in Innsbruck, in a tiny, beautiful provincial town in the Tyrol in Western Austria. And that, in many ways, is the character within the book. Over to you, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Meriel. And we've had so many questions, so much interest. And one of the major themes that's emerged is it seems that many of our followers and those who read the books with us have, during various lockdowns or through this vortex of change, tried to write or start a book themselves. And many have commented it's quite a challenging process, and have asked, as you've completed it and obviously researched it in a period of time, but wrote it in quite a tight window, for your sort of thoughts on a first book, right? Any advice, sort of top tips that you might share, Meriel?
I'm a huge advocate of writing, creative writing, as a curative process, a redemptive process, in that my approach to the writing was very much needing to sort out thoughts that were in my head, stories that were whirling around in my head after my father died. And also I needed to sort documents out. I'm a lawyer, so bringing order to facts, bringing order to documents is what I do. And I think in terms of tips on writing, you can write about anything, and there are some very good writing organisations out there. One which I would hugely commend to you is a charity which I'm a trustee of, which is called Arvon, the Arvon Foundation, ARVON. And it's a wonderful charity which also has 3 writing houses which all have literary connections. And you can go to those houses, or in lockdown, it was obviously all virtual, and you can spend a week learning the craft of writing. And they will do poetry, they'll do novels, they do courses on all sorts of things. And being a trustee, I thought I ought to go on one of these courses, which I did in 2018. And I think that very much opened the floodgates of the writing for me. So it was helpful having a time and a place. And as Virginia Woolf says, you know, what is the enemy of the writer? It's the pram in the hall or the briefcase in the hall, if you're a business person or a lawyer, because obviously there is always distraction from writing. So you need to carve out time and space. Now, with me, I had the compelling nature of needing to order my thoughts. So that was a good starting point. When I went with my husband and sister and brother-in-law to clear out my father's house, I was faced with unbelievable numbers of documents which we had to sort and try and bring order to. And most importantly of all, I was also incredibly lucky in that I inherited 13 photo albums. And these photo albums are extraordinary. They're shabby, they're full of black and white photos, but without any writing in them. So I was very curious about those photo albums. So I wanted to find out where the people were in them or what had happened to them. But in terms of tips about writing, I would say try and put yourself on a writing course. So you carve out time and approach it as a proper professional thing that you do. Out of that course, try and select some buddies, try and select some people that you then carry on meeting with and carry on reading your writing to, because it's the performance of the stuff that you write. Reading it out is incredibly important. And I think stick at it. You have to, writing is a craft. You can learn it and stick at it. And then a sort of more at the other end of it, once you've got something that has some shape to it, then start talking to people about it. Start talking to literary agents or people, mates in publishing, friends who've published books, and say, does this sound like something that people might be interested in? Or is it a private project? And there is nothing wrong with a private project, a private writing project. You know, that's fine too. In fact, my project started off, I had no intent, I'm a total accidental author. I had no intention of getting published. It was simply, I was writing this up for my kids so that I was bringing order to my own thoughts. But it just, everything spooled out from there.
So a number of people are joining. So to remind you, I'm interviewing Meriel Schindler, her great book, The Lost Cafe Schindler. Yep, picture there too. And when Meriel and I last year, in one of the short breaks in between what seemed like endless lockdown, we went for tea, as you do, actually in one of Miss Marple's, Agatha Christie's favorite haunts, what was called Hotel Bartram. Anyway, we had tea, and as Meriel was describing her grandfather, her relations, I was thinking, wow, I've never heard Meriel quite so sort of sentimental. And obviously Meriel and I are usually doing the hostage negotiation she talked about earlier. So, I wouldn't really want her to be that sentimental. So I was thinking, wow, this is a very warm and emotionally articulate side of Meriel. And then when I read the book, I think one of the amazing skills is how you manage not to over characterize or perhaps sentimentalize these wonderful relations and relatives who you were obviously learning more about. How was that achieved? Is that just your natural persona coming through? Did you get advice on that? I think that's very well done, personally.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I think because it was so important to get it right, and it wasn't a novel, every word in there, apart from one chapter which I flag towards the end as being invented, every word in there was true. So every word was drawn either from me describing a photo, or reading a letter, or reading a book. And so I was confident that what was going in was accurate. And I was, in order to honor the people who are in the book, and particularly the ones who didn't make it out of Austria, I felt I needed to stick quite closely to what I could absolutely identify as true. And, obviously when you're reading someone's personal letters, 80, 90 years afterwards, you're doing a little bit of interpretation. But I was very clear I wasn't going to stray to, sentimentalize or create a novel. It was very important to me that it was true.
Yes. Well, I think you did a marvelous job. And there is a deep topicality as we think about the news. Yesterday, I'm sat here, as you know, in Oxford, that Oxford University, a couple of colleges have removed certain monuments and pictures, not least of the Queen of England, but also Cecil Rhodes. And you and I talked a little about monuments. What is the right way, the sort of respectful way, an effective way to record very important and interesting things. And that could not be more topical at this time. And it seems to me that you've created a sort of memorial out of the Cafe Schindler. And I don't know whether that's me just being fanciful or whether that was your intent.
Yes, I thought I did quite a lot of thinking about monuments. So obviously the historical centre of my book is the Holocaust, it's the Second World War, it's what happened to the Jews. But there is a more universal message in there, which is how do we look at these events that are difficult events, and that's applicable to whether you're talking to the US and the slave trade, whether you're talking about Southeast Asia. It's applicable to how you deal with the difficult moments in your past as a nation. Now, for those who know a little bit about the Second World War, they may know less about Austria. I think Germany, by and large, dealt very well with its past once it got to dealing with it, and there are a large amount of investment in Germany has gone into understanding its past and essentially processing it and dealing with it. The Austrians took a completely different path. The Austrians saw themselves, they invented themselves as Hitler's first victim. This is despite the fact that all the photos show them as flag-waving enthusiasts when the Nazis arrived in 1938. And it was not really until about 10, 15 years ago that the younger sort of historians started to ask questions about how Austria had treated its past. Reparations were very slow to come through. Statues were very slow to go up, and indeed in some centres there are no statues at all. And so it's really only in the last 10 years that it's people have started to think about this, as the generation of perpetrators and victims is now pretty much no longer with us. The next generation and the generation beyond that need to work out how to deal with us. And I have some thoughts on that. I think that putting up a statue is not always the answer. I think we've got quite a lot of statues, Holocaust statues to great people. That's not always the answer. And I think Austria has started to look at completely different ways of doing this. For example, I took part in the recording of a sort of town basically a podcast that you could have on whilst you were walking around the town and listen to what happened in different bits of the town. So something that tourists could use, something that school kids could use. And I think that's an interesting way of doing it. So you're incorporating the past into into storytelling, which I think is fundamentally, as humans, we like stories. And going back to Harriet's point about the cafe, is yes, it is a monument. It's a monument to, in a sense, the ability of Jews to move somewhere, move to a new town, set up an incredible institution. And it's a monument to what happened to them. The cafe was, of course, taken away from my grandfather in 1938. It was turned into the local Nazi watering hole. All the Nazis hung out there, did their gambling, did their singing there. And then after the end of the war, it was given back to my grandfather, although sadly he didn't live for very long. He did reopen the cafe. It was again an amazing place for people to dance and listen to music and drink good coffee and eat lovely cakes. But after he died,
sorry, I was going to say, I've got to come on to cake in a minute.
After he died, my father was a terrible businessman and he sold the cafe, and it was gone for many, many, many years until a restaurateur wanted to open a cafe in the same building, essentially. And he knew nothing about my family or its history. And everywhere he turned, to the planning officer, to his family, they said, it's got to be called the Cafe Schindler. Who are these people? And he went to the archives, worked out it had this extraordinary, nearly 100-year history. And so he's opened an Art Deco style cafe in the middle of Innsbruck. So my name is back up on the high street. And I love this because it shows the versatility, it shows the endurance of something that could be built from scratch in 1922, when Austria was on its knees financially, and my father decided to launch a cafe almost as an antidote to the horrors of fighting in the First World War. So it's got this beautiful story arc to it.
Beautiful. And for everyone, I know people are joining us, we're reviewing the Lost Cafe Schindler. Privileged to have Meriel Schindler with us. And we've just been talking about some, serious and important go forward issues around monuments and Meriel's view on that. We have, however, had also a number of questions around the beautiful cups and cake. Some of us were delighted to see that cake featured in the book, which doesn't often happen. But tell us a little bit about how we get to have recipes in the book, which I think is amazing. And do you have an artifact of the amazing Art Deco Schindler cups in real life to show us?
So yes, I do. So I'm going to show you, first of all, an original Schindler cup. And I think artifacts are very eloquent. They tell a story without words, and they're tactile. So I'm going to show you the cups that we had as children. Now, these were the cups. I don't know, hopefully you can see that.
You can see it perfectly.
These were the cups we drank out our hot chocolate out of as children. They're sort of clunky. I knew that they'd come from the cafe. I knew that we'd had a cafe, but I didn't really know very much more than that. So there you can see the eagle, which is very similar to the eagle of the Tiroler eagle, but also the Habsburg eagle, and the S for Cafe Schindler. So that's my exhibit number one, if you like. And when in 1938 the Nazis took over the cafe and took it from my grandfather, the Nazi who did that was a chap called Franz Hebel. And this is the cup that he introduced, which you will see has a startling resemblance to the first cup. So he didn't bother, that he knew the cafe was such a good place. It had such good branding. He didn't even bother to change the branding. He just slapped his H onto the eagle and carried on. Because why fix it if
why wouldn't you?
And as children, we used both cups and I never really questioned why there was an H on some of them and an S on others of them. I just didn't know, which was one of the mysteries I needed to unravel after my father died.
And the cake piece. I was just looking. We have another question to go back to. There's some intriguing questions following your great thoughts on monuments. We can't not answer the question on the cake. Good for you that we've got recipes in the book.
I'm half Austrian, so I thought and it was a cafe about cakes. They won awards for that apple strudel. So, the book was going to have cakes in it. And one of the things I did was I initially wrote, and this is the thing about writing, it's also about rewriting. It's not being afraid to rewrite. So I initially had each chapter heading as a cake and a recipe because I had enough. And my literary agent said, "You have got to be joking. You cannot possibly write about Nazis and strudel in the same chapter. It just doesn't work." I'm like, okay, what do I know? Anyway, we had a bit of a battle about recipes, and he said, "This is not a cookbook. You are not writing a cookbook. You're writing a very serious family memoir, and you must not put recipes in it." Anyway, needless to say, there are recipes in it. I won a little bit of the battle in that there are recipes right at the end. He was very unkeen on recipes. It is fair to say that most of the people who've read the book love the fact there are recipes in it. So what does a publisher know and what does the literary agent know? So another tip for the writing is that you will get a lot of advice. Some of it will be spot on. And I suspect he was right. I suspect it was a bit fanciful, calling the chapter headings after cakes. But, stick to your guns if you are absolutely convinced of one aspect of it, but allow yourself to be guided. Don't be rigid in your thinking.
Yeah. We've had a couple of questions just taking us back to the monuments question, and what do you and I think about the removal of monuments that reflect a sad time in history? And I think you may be interested, to give a view directly on the question. I certainly have a very modern quote that from a writer that we had on this LinkedIn Live, I guess a couple of months ago, Pamela Fuller, who's written one of the great guides on unconscious bias. And in talking to her, she talked about words and symbolism matter, and what's appropriate evolves over time. Yeah. And it's essential to listen, watch, learn, engage, and re-engage. And I thought that was very neat advice that can be applied here. But your thoughts, Meriel? There are many monuments being torn down at this time.
I think that it's very interesting that there's a lot that you can say about monuments. I think the fundamental starting point is to understand that monuments often say more about the time in which they are erected than the time they commemorate. And my standout example of that is a monument that is just outside what was the site of essentially the collection camp just outside Innsbruck, on the edge of Innsbruck, which is called the Reichenau camp. Very undervisited, I have to say. No one goes there anymore. No one even knows it's there, but that's another story. And there is a monument there that was put up in 1972. So a generation after the war ended. And the monument basically talks about the fact that patriots died there. Patriots were sort of collected together there and they died there. Now, it's fair to say my great-uncle was shot in cold blood by a leading Nazi there. So I did not take very well to the idea that he had been described as a patriot who died there. Patriots, in my view, choose their love of their country, and certainly my great-uncle, whilst he may have loved his country, did not choose to be in that camp because he was a patriot. He was only there for the very only reason was because he was Jewish by birth. And so I was extremely upset about this memorial. And one of the things that I have concluded is that if it's taken down, what it does is it takes away from the whole Nazi denying, Holocaust denying aspect of Austria's sort of middle years since the war to about 10 years ago. Whereas what is perhaps more interesting is if we reconsider that sort of memorial and contextualize it. And by that I mean you maybe put up something else that says this memorial was erected in 1972 and reflects the thinking at the time. We now know X number of Jews died in this camp, Y number of people were tortured in this camp, and Z number of people managed to escape from the camp. And that would be more helpful and more informative than just taking the memorial away. So I think one needs to re-engage with these things. And there's another good example of this, which is the term Cristal Nacht, which is a beautiful poetic term used very widely in historical books and in articles about essentially what was an organized pogrom in November 1938, where the Nazis set out to beat up the Jews, and not to kill them necessarily, but to beat them up, to make sure, to persuade them to leave the country. The word Kristallnacht is now, by most modern historians, not used because they call it a pogrom. So again, they're revisiting terminology just to see whether that is still right. And I think that's appropriate. And I think it's interesting because, yeah, Kristallnacht is a rather beautiful term for what was a night of mayhem and violence.
Yes, yes. So we've come to, I think, the end of our little session together, and I've saved the most asked question and a brief response from you as we close, and the question from me too, is after writing the book, have you realigned, reordered your own thoughts about your father? Has it helped with that in any way?
Yes, I think writing is a redemptive process, if I'm honest. I think it has allowed me to lay to rest my very troubled relationship with my father. It's allowed me to stop being angry. I was very angry with him for most of my life because, as you will read in the book, he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well and lied a lot about what he'd been through, as you will find out in the book. And I've laid to rest that. And although my father died destitute, we didn't inherit a big estate or anything, what I realise now is that what he has gifted me is a fabulously rich history, which has taken me 3 years to unravel and write up in total, and which where I really, really love my history. And I hope that you love the story that has arisen out of my history.
Oh, I absolutely do. And not just because I know you, but because it is a really, really important book, and I think it is enjoyable. And I recommend to all of you The Lost Cafe Schindler, and a big, big thank you to Meriel Schindler for sharing her thoughts and views with us. Thank you, Meriel, very much.
You're very, very welcome.